particularly with the federal funding, but also state and local funding. And we tend to rely mostly on local funding and real estate taxes to fund our schools, which means that wealthier areas have better resources and areas that are struggling more economically have less resources.
When families enter the world of special education, they're often told it's built to protect and support students. But too often, it's a maze that leaves parents exhausted, isolated, and fighting to be heard. What happens when caregiving becomes advocacy and advocacy becomes a full-time job? Amy Mackin, author of Henry's Classroom, A Special Education in American Motherhood, joins us to talk about the personal and systemic costs of navigating an educational system that was never designed with true equity in mind. That's straight ahead on episode 290. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Every time I walk into a conference session lately, I feel it. There's this growing momentum of neurodiversity affirming practices, and more educators, more counselors, and more parents are asking better questions and building better systems for our kids. This fall, I'm speaking at a bunch of different conferences and a handful of other schools and districts around the country. We'll have a booth at the Association for Middle-Level Education Conference and the National Association for Gifted Children Conference, as well as several other state-level conferences, too. Keep an eye on my social media pages for updates about where you can find me. And if you'll be at any of those events, I hope you'll come say hello, stop by the booth, or join one of my sessions. It means so much to connect in person and see how these ideas are actually taking root in your communities. Okay, Amy Mackin is with me in a minute.
On a recent episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
One of the core and very tragic findings that we have found with the BGALS study, the Berkeley Girls with ADHD longitudinal study, by their teen years and early adult years, these girls, compared to a matched neurotypical comparison group, are at very high risk for self-injury, cutting, burning, so-called non-suicidal self-injury, and also frank suicide attempts. Girls may tend to internalize the negative feedback and the stigma, and with no one to talk to about it and feeling ashamed of their condition, they may not even know they have a condition called ADHD. We have to figure out the kinds of early interventions, and we've got some good evidence-based interventions that can prevent this very self-destructive course.
That's episode 278, Girls and ADHD. Find it on your favorite podcast platform.
Today, I'm joined by writer Amy Mackin. Amy's work looks at the intersections of education, cultural history, public health, and social equity, with essays published in places like The Atlantic, Chalkbeat, and The Washington Post. Her debut hybrid memoir, Henry's Classroom, A Special Education in American Motherhood, explores her family's journey navigating special education and what it reveals about our larger systems of care and support. Amy, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started and dig into some of the bigger themes surrounding advocacy and education policy, I'd love for listeners to get a sense of Henry's journey. Can you share a bit about his story and how the path that he's been on started to show you where the system was leaving kids like him behind?
So at about 15 months, at a routine pediatrician's visit, our pediatrician felt that there was some developmental delays happening, and she referred us to early intervention. My older child had had a speech delay and had gone to early intervention, so I had no worries. I had no concerns about calling them. My daughter went through early intervention, caught up, and started school with no issues at all with speech. So we had a therapist come out. That was the first therapist was not a good fit. And it took me a while because I really didn't understand at that point, what Henry was struggling with, that I just, probably let that go on a little too long. And then eventually I did ask for a new therapist. And the new therapist came out. I call her Rose in the book. She was wonderful. She seemed to really click with Henry and understand him. And she helped us. She was the beginning of helping us navigate the system. And at 3 years old, our early intervention turns into what they called then a special needs preschool that's run by the district. And it was there that I realized, with input from Rose as we did that transition, it was there that I realized that by that point, Henry had gone to 2 different developmental centers and he had a developmental medicine team that had given us, great recommendations about what he needed in order to thrive. And we went to the essentially district funded or state funded preschool, and he was not given the services that the medical team recommended. This was new to me, and I still didn't, I kind of assumed they knew what they were doing, and that, I was new to this and I needed to kind of take in all that information and just follow their lead. And that's what happened. And 2 years at the special needs preschool turned into kindergarten on an IEP. And then as we moved through elementary school, we consistently had issues with Henry getting what he needed in order to be supported enough to access the curriculum.
So with that process, you're noticing over time his needs aren't being met,
Right.
And trying to navigate the system, trying to work with the public schools, but really struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit more specifically about what some of those needs are that you felt like weren't getting met?
Definitely the social needs. And I think that's a struggle within the public system, probably no matter where you are, in the sense that academically, he was testing in most places, above average to above average. He struggled pretty severely socially.
Mm-hmm.
There was just no mechanism within the public school to really address that. There were just a few interventions. One of them I talk about in the book, that was, I think, 3rd grade. It was a lunch bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually really helped Henry because he was very much at that point withdrawing, kind of sitting at the back of the classroom, not engaging, definitely self-isolating, and, starting to realize that he was different and, struggling to fit in. And at the lunch bunch, what happened was they would have a couple of kids on IEPs or 504 plans, and they were invited to bring another student with them that was not on an IEP or 504 plan. And then they would go into they'd have a lunch session with the adjustment counselor, and they would talk about their challenges. And it was a wonderful program because it helped Henry talk about and sort of learn to understand and articulate his own challenges, but also it helped kids who did not have disabilities understand those challenges that their classmates had as well. And that was wonderful. But just a couple months into that, the adjustment counselor had to take a leave of absence. And Henry's school, his elementary school, and the middle school across the street began sharing one counselor. You're talking like 2,500 students.
Wow.
Sharing one counselor. And so Henry's lunch bunch went from once a week to once a month, and then disappeared altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And that was maybe the one social intervention in place. And he needed a lot more than that. One of his really big challenges was times like recess and lunch. Just navigating that, like, where do I sit?
Mm-hmm.
How do I engage with these other students? Those were really his challenges. But what we found is the school is designed to address academic deficiencies, if you will. And because those weren't as problematic for Henry, he just wasn't getting the attention or the amount of services he needed. But also he did need occupational therapy, which he wasn't getting enough of. He had trouble holding a pencil. When he was in early intervention, at 18 months, he had the gross motor skills and fine motor skills of about an 8-month-old. He had a complex diagnosis because of the different challenges, and he did not have a specific diagnosis until he was 6 years old, almost 7. And so I think the system in some ways didn't know what to do with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of it as well.
I find it interesting to think about how the medical community and the educational community, they kind of run in parallels, but not always collaborating as effectively as possible, not always even calling things by similar names. And so do you find that was a barrier, or was it just one of those things that kind of happened that didn't really impact things too much? I don't know. Do you feel like that influenced everything?
That was a huge barrier. Huge. I would say probably our biggest barrier was the lack of communication that the IEP team at the public school, there was really zero communication other than a report that the developmental team at the medical center, submitted with their recommendations. A member of the medical team was never invited to IEP meetings. There was just no communication at all. And that had real effects. At one point at the preschool level, the medical team had recommended summer services and increased speech therapy for Henry. We were told that by the school, they do their own evaluations, and they said he didn't qualify for summer services and increased speech therapy. And part of that I know is budget. They're all working with very limited budgets. So he did not get those services. I wasn't able to replicate those services. I could get him speech therapy privately in the summer, but I couldn't replicate a classroom environment. And I couldn't find an occupational therapist that took our health insurance. And so all he got was private speech therapy. And over the summer, when he was retested in the fall, he had regressed significantly because of not getting those services. So I think that was a huge barrier to getting his needs met, for sure.
Yeah. I know parents of kids who need that extra support often end up having all of these different roles that I hear you kind of talking about, but like not only are you the caregiver, but you're the case manager and the advocate, and sometimes this translator going between these different systems. And that requires constant vigilance. It requires a lot of effort, and it takes a real emotional toll. Oftentimes, I feel like that just isn't seen by educators or policymakers. From your perspective, what do you think we miss when we don't acknowledge how that weight of that labor impacts families? And what do you think would look different if perhaps they did?
Well, first of all, I think it creates huge inequity. I was in a position, I was fortunate enough, it was still a real challenge, but I was fortunate enough to have a spouse with a full-time job and access to health insurance. If I was a single parent, I would not have had the ability to advocate for Henry the way that I did. And eventually, when we decided to leave the public system, I had to leave my day job, so that it has huge economic impact. So that's one thing. I just think if it was more of a holistic system, where the family was involved, where medical practitioners were involved, even the community, where community resources were brought in. I think that student is just going by nature to do better when everybody is on the same page. Putting that on the family, having the family have to fill those gaps. What I talk about in the book, and I've talked about a lot, is when IDEA was put into place, which was originally under a different name. It was in 1975, it was passed. I think that the spirit of it was to serve these needs in a more holistic way so that kids had access to the full educational ecosystem. I don't feel as though they have that now. And I think part of that is budgetary restrictions. When IDEA was passed, Congress had committed to paying 40%. The federal government was going to pay 40% of the cost of educating a child with a disability, pay 40% of the cost of special education. In the 50 years that IDEA has been on the books, that promise has never been met. And recently, the latest reports say the funding is around 12%.
Wow.
And yet we know the costs of these services are going up and up every year. And so schools are struggling to meet that demand and often failing. And we just had a report come out in my state in February where the Department of Education at the federal level said that my state had not met the needs of children. They had failed to meet the needs of children with special education and identify kids who needed assistance and get them that assistance at more of a systemic level. Our state is considered to have one of the better school systems in the country.
Right.
So I think students are being really left behind. And I think if we could, I think that gap, particularly with the federal funding, but also state and local funding, and we tend to rely mostly on local funding and real estate taxes to fund our schools, which means that wealthier areas have better resources and areas that are struggling more economically have less resources. So it creates that equity right there. And again, puts that work on the families to fill those gaps. In over 80% of heterosexual partnerships with children, we know that 80% of the primary caregivers for those children are women. So there's definitely a gender inequity there too. It's really, really difficult for families.
I'd love for you to also talk about another factor that I think sometimes gets overlooked, which is that social isolation that families feel. Because when you're going through this system, when you are feeling like if you realize that public school isn't the right setting for your family, like there's a difficult time with creating that community that often surrounds kids' educational processes. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that impacted you and your family?
There was a lot of social isolation. I think part of it was just not understanding. Once my son was diagnosed with autism, just not really understanding what that meant, the challenges that go along with that. So that was part of it. Leaving the system, as you mentioned, or trying to find a new system that would be more supportive really isolated me, because I think especially with younger families, a lot of your social interaction comes from school activities for both the student and the parents. That was really difficult. I had 2 other children that were in traditional school settings once we took Henry out, trying to be there for them and also spend the day with Henry and getting Henry to alternative classes and that sort of thing on my own meant that I never really was able to forge those relationships with other parents.
Yeah.
I really had no access. I didn't even know about or was aware of any support group for parents whose kids had disabilities at that point. I felt really isolated.
Yeah, without having that network, it's hard then to figure out not only how do you navigate, because there's just some of that other knowledge that's shared.
Right.
We know that kids all learn in different ways, but schools really often rely on kind of this one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening is that it doesn't really fit anybody. And so kids feel frustrated and misunderstood, or they're written off as behavior problems. How have you seen those mismatches play out for students like Henry and their peers?
The one-size-fits-all approach really didn't work for Henry. I think in the end, that is probably why we ended up having to leave the public system more than anything. There was a lot of problems with access and just sort of an assumption of social norms or social understanding of certain communications that Henry didn't understand, and there was no one there helping him understand. And we again with the sort of the medical system and the school system sort of running in parallel, the medical group that was working with Henry recommended that he have like a paraprofessional with him to help him, to help translate that a little bit and navigate some of those things. And the school said they did not have the resources to offer that. And so I would visit the classroom occasionally, and I would see, a group of students, this happened in kindergarten, playing a game with the teacher, and Henry off by himself in a corner doing a puzzle over and over again because he just didn't know how to engage with the larger group. And no one was helping him learn how to do that. And so that wasn't fixing itself on its own. He needed guidance and support in how to learn how to navigate that and engage. And that just gets worse and worse each year because as students get older, it becomes more and more of a social gap.
Absolutely.
Which is what happened. That was a really big issue. And what's really interesting to me is just, and again, this was all very new to me. I had no formal teaching experience, no, formal research experience at that time. But after I witnessed, when we took Henry out of public school. And I engaged with some homeschooling groups as well as just some alternative schooling groups and some all kinds of community resources, all kinds of different things to try to build an individualized education program that would actually work for him. One of the things I noticed is at some of the rec groups, the kids would meet. We went to a few homeschooling kind of recreational groups. So they were multi-age and there were younger kids. I mean, it was a big age gap at the recreational groups because whole families came. They had, multiple kids of multiple different ages. And what I noticed was how incredibly well the older kids did at mentoring the younger children. And I would see these different things play out, like an older child, maybe a 11-year-old would say to maybe a 5-year-old that was doing something or saying something, inappropriate. The 11-year-old would say, we don't say that. And that's not, and like without any adult intervention, I was seeing this mentorship go on, which was just fascinating to me. And I was seeing the sort of independent thinking skills and the ability to advocate was amazing to me because I hadn't really seen that, and giving the room to self-advocate or to self-correct your behavior and all of that. That was amazing to me. And afterwards, I did some research, and there is some research on multi-age classrooms. And the latest research has found that multi-age classrooms are as effective academically as the single-age classroom system we have now, and are actually more effective for social learning. And I saw that play out in front of me, so I wasn't surprised, but it was amazing to see that research kind of confirm what I had seen. And it struck me like this is what we should be advocating for, on the playground, in the lunchroom. But I think keeping the one-size-fits-all sort of strategy, keeping a group of kids from the same towns, relatively same socioeconomic class, same age, keeping them all together in the same classroom really limits their ability to learn and expand their understanding of other people.
It's interesting to think about that. I always think it's interesting. It's like, oh, you were born in the same 365-day window as these other students, so here you go and stay together for the next 13 years.
Right.
In so many ways, socially, academically, like there's just a lot of benefits that they're missing out on.
Absolutely.
So you found these homeschool groups, and I think homeschooling is so interesting because it's really different depending on how families end up getting there. Like sometimes it's a deliberate choice because they just want to really build that learning environment that's very affirming and flexible. Other times it's like a last resort because we just can't find anything that will work for our kid. What are some of your thoughts about how that discrepancy impacts people, kind of how it impacted your process with everything with Henry?
It's interesting because when we decided, I was definitely a last resort person. I had never considered homeschooling. I had no philosophical ideas about, that this was the right thing to do or anything like that. It really felt like a last resort to me. And I had some stereotypes in my head of what I might find when I went to to people who did have very strong philosophical ideas about homeschooling. What I found in a lot of these groups is that the motivations varied so widely why people were there. It was so interesting to me. So just in the first group that we got together with, and we just started with like getting together with recreational sort of groups. We were doing a lot of online schooling or after school programs in the beginning at home, but just for recreation and social contact, I was engaging with these groups. And there were military families who moved very often and felt like it was just too disruptive to their children to keep putting them in a public school and taking them out again. So there was that group. We had a family who had older children and they had waited a long time to have their youngest one, and their lives had just changed at that point, and they were traveling, and so they decided that they were going to just bring the younger one along on these travels, which was amazing because this young person had just been all over the world. Just an amazing education in that way. So there was just that was just a personal choice. Definitely had families where it was an educational philosophy and they were homeschooling all of their children. I always just homeschooled Henry. My other two were always in traditional education which was really challenging. I will say I didn't meet anyone that was doing that. And that was really challenging because I had one foot in the public school or traditional school schedule that I had to abide by. And then I had this other foot in alternative schooling, homeschooling. It was actually just a really wide group of people and families and motivations. We had some people with food allergies that found that the school was just not able to really keep their children safe from specific allergies. We had a student that was dyslexic and just wasn't getting what they needed. And their family just found that it was much better for them to learn at their own pace than sort of be forced into a specific schedule of learning because they kept falling behind. And finding private teachers, there was, obviously with these alternative classrooms, these different learning groups that we were in, the teacher to student ratio was much, much smaller. Essentially, we took classes. We discovered so many different places that had these homeschooling classes. For example, here in Boston, the New England Aquarium was offering like marine biology classes to homeschoolers.
Cool.
The Museum of Fine Arts was offering art history classes to homeschoolers. So we were taking advantage of all that. We were doing a whole civics project in Providence, Rhode Island, where for 2 weeks, the students went all day, every day for 2 weeks and essentially built a municipal government from the ground up. In this vacant office building.
That's cool.
So it was like all these incredible learning experiences that were open to us that I didn't even know existed. But I guess what I really struggled with is why couldn't the public school, why weren't they accessing these things? Because I really felt like so many of the community groups or the community resources that we accessed, if students had access to those as well that were in the public system, I feel like we might have been able to make something work. One of the things that I found as we were going through this is that in the UK, they have districts that offer something called flexi schooling, where the student is actually a funded public school student, but can go to the public school for certain classes, say a couple days a week, and then access other classes and other curriculum in different ways outside of the public school and still be like a fully funded public school student. And that was fascinating to me because I thought that kind of arrangement could have worked for Henry.
Yeah.
But it wasn't an option. You're either in or out.
Obviously, when you're doing the homeschooling, you're not as worried about the IEP process, but obviously the IEP process is part of what brought you to the homeschooling.
Right.
IEPs can feel really rigid and sometimes outdated and sometimes even adversarial. If we were to think about how to reimagine the IEP process, what do you think would need to change so it actually reflects the realities of kids and parents and how they're living right now?
I would say, first of all, you need to have an IEP. There's a yearly mandated IEP meeting, and parents can request one, outside of that annual update. But I would say that there should be quarterly updates. There should be quarterly meetings for the IEP that include the family, the teacher, any therapists or counselors involved, with that student at the school, and a member of that student's medical team, should the family want that, if they feel that could contribute. I think it should be a wider circle that is contributing to that IEP for that student. And as the child gets older, as the student gets older, the student should have the ability to have their own input in that IEP. It's interesting because in my home state, they just updated the IEP resources available. They updated them for the first time in over 20 years. And the form now allows for a student, like specifically an older student, say middle school or high school, to actually talk about what might work for them. Because everybody's talking for the students, but the students are rarely consulted.
I think that's so important. And I would say not even middle school and high school. We should ask younger kids. They know what works and what doesn't. And
they know.
It gives them a chance to have some autonomy, to have a voice in that process, as opposed to just feeling like education is something that's being done to them.
Absolutely. And I also think that it reduces some of the shame, because I know my son felt that.
Yes.
You just feel this kind of like you're ostracized, and there's some sort of shame in being different or learning differently.
Yeah.
I would like to see that minimized, because that definitely contributes to both academic and social problems in the school as well.
Yeah. Well, Amy, this conversation has been so great. I know we could keep on talking, but as we wrap up, I have one last question for you. So if you were talking right now to a parent who is navigating the world of educational advocacy for their child, what would you want to say to them? What is one thing that you think is really important for them to hear?
That you're not alone. See if your state requires a special education parent advisory council. Some states require that. Some districts, even in states that require that, have applied for waivers so that they don't have to have those. But I would say advocate for that. Find that community of other parents who are also struggling, because I do think there's a lot of support there. I didn't have that, but I think that they're more common now. And I think that finding that support is the first step. And like you said, that those shared resources, finding out where people are getting, where their students might be finding additional resources outside of the public school that have been helpful. So yeah, that would be my very first thing, is just try to find other parents that are struggling with this as well.
Yeah.
And see how you can help one another.
It's so powerful to feel like you're not alone in all of this.
Right.
Amy Mackin, author of Henry's Classroom, A Special Education in American Motherhood. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
Belonging is one of those words we use a lot, but it's easy to forget what it really means. In schools, it's the difference between being placed somewhere and being part of something. A student might have access to a mainstream classroom, a gifted program, or a special education setting through an IEP, but paperwork alone can't create belonging. That happens when a child is accepted for who they are, not only accommodated for what they need. Families know this better than anyone. They spend hours in meetings, translating their child's strengths into the language of goals and services, hoping someone in the room truly sees their child. Advocacy shouldn't have to be the price of belonging, because real inclusion isn't just about access. It's about building classrooms where every learner feels safe to be themselves, without needing permission to fit. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Amy Mackin, thank you for being here. There are links in the show notes to find her work, and also in those show notes, links to all of our social media pages and groups. If you're like me at all, you're trying hard to get away from the garbage heap of misinformation that social media has become. Oh yes, I'm jaded. And one way to do that is to like and follow accounts you trust. So come on over. We only talk about puppies and unicorns and lollipops and, stuff like that. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.